First off, just thanks to everyone here for hosting me and my friends as we traveled here to Ukraine. It's great to be here. If you could all briefly introduce yourselves. My name's Ryan Evans. I founded War on the Rocks. If we could start at this end, please.
My name is Andriy Zagorodnyuk. I'm chairman of Center for Defense Strategies, Minister of Defense 1920.
Illia Ponomarenko, defense guy at the Kyiv Independent.
Sam Cook, I'm the founder and director of the Borderlands Foundation, historical center for the war in Ukraine.
My name is Konrad, Muzyka. I'm a defense analyst and the director of Rochan consulting.
Kofman, military analyst, work at CNA.
And we're going to be talking about a variety of things related to the war as it's gone so far. Again, it's great to be in Kiev talking about the war, and thanks for our Ukrainian friends for indulging in speaking in English for this panel as well. Much appreciated. Thank you. Let's start with you. You were Minister of Defense, of course, just a few years ago. What were some of the reforms that the Ukrainian military were making? And I believe you were head of the reform office in the ministry before that as well, right? If you could talk about some of the reforms that led to this Ukrainian military performance that was frankly much better than so many people expected once the war started, which must be rooted in the reforms in some way, I would imagine.
Yeah, of course. So, well, first of all, it's a direct battlefield experience, which some forces had. So they've been doing that type of artillery war for years, and obviously they have just a practical experience. Secondly, we obviously need to understand that we have lots of NATO standards being adopted, either formally or even informally, because about 10,000 service people were trained every year with the operations Orbital GMTGU from the United States and Unifier with Canada, and with some other countries participating. Then we had obviously change of the doctrine, substantial change that introduced, for example, a principle of mission command, capability-based planning. So right now, for example, we can see a massive difference between the way armed forces are organized and the decisions are made in a much more centralized way than in Russia. I believe that it has a massive impact everywhere, starting from the general staff and ending up on the battlefield. And also we had a substantial reform of this non-commissioned officers corps, changed from the Soviet system to sort of similar to NATO kind of system. I can't say that we are totally like 100% already army, but we endorsed a lot of these principles, and they worked through the years, and as such they are improving the efficiency. So it's all about the efficiency, because obviously our budget was from 11 to 20 times less than Russian. And from numerical perspective, the capabilities are uncomparable, but from the efficiency perspective, the Ukrainian army is much better, obviously. So that's, like, in a nutshell, key things which I would pick up from the start.
And were any of these reforms more politically difficult than others, going back to the previous administration through the current administration and before the start of the war?
Well, some of them were difficult just because it's a change, and the change is always difficult. Change always creates resistance. Some people were not really adopting changes, some people were resisting, and some people just didn't understand. But over the time, the new generation of officer generals came, which used to be majors or lieutenant colonels or colonels when the war started. Now they are like playing a key role in the armed forces. So that we had like this massive generational change in the armed forces, and that helped tremendously.
I'd love to return to that, but Ilya, how long have you been covering the Ukrainian military?
Well, basically since the big wars day one. I mean, since 14. First as a student in Mariupol, then as a simple civilian, then as a guy who wanted to do something good for the military, who wanted to, assist. And then as a journalist in my hometown, Volnovakha, and then in Kiev. So it's just stepping up at every point. So right now we're here.
So you were covering back in 2014 in Mariupol. You were covering it back then as well. Could you tell us? You get to interview me a bit later, so this is my chance to grill you.
Oh yeah. Well, I was 22 when this whole thing started. So days of my youth, very naive. Had a very simple part-time job as a bookstore guy, and then this whole thing starts, And early days of war in Mariupol, and also the whole of the year 14 was like a mixture of student joys and weird things that everybody does in his youth, her youth, and also things like seeing howitzers in the streets, seeing tanks in the streets, learning what the explosion is, how does it sound like, how the war sound like. So it was always a mixture, the anarchy in the city, because for several months, let's say 3 or 2 months, Mariupol was not under Ukrainian control. No authorities, no nothing, no police, no fire, emergency service. So the central part of the city was occupied by DNR militants. So they were in charge of control, and the rest of the city was basically an anarchy in which workers had to self-organize to patrol their own neighborhoods from plants, and lack of food supplies, lots of troubles in this regard, no public transport, for instance. University lecturers and teachers, they asked us as male students to take care of the girls as we see them to their houses, because the situation is very volatile. And at some point in mid-July, I wake up to the sound of explosion, in lots of gunfire, and I get in this thought that our military has gone. So that was the day when Mariupol was liberated, and within just a snap, normal life gets back, absolutely normal life. City is very peaceful. It's basically the same Mariupol pre-war again. And then 8 years after, we see those streets and those places. My bookstore that I work with, in Nova Poshta chapter that I work as a loader, also in shambles and in ashes. All those streets, all those drama theaters. So yeah. So my point is that I have seen this war as a civilian guy and also as a journalist from inside of there.
Great, thank you. Sam, you probably have the lowest public profile of all the people on this panel, so why don't you tell us where your story with Ukraine began?
Well, I was a U.S. Army officer, and my last job in the U.S. Army was teaching history at West Point. And they asked me what I wanted to study, Russian or Chinese history, to teach the cadets, and I studied Russian history at New York University, met a bunch of Ukrainians and people from Russia, Belarus that all lived in the city. So when I left the Army, I traveled the world while Maidan was happening. I remember seeing that on television and moving to Poland, and eventually made my way to Ukraine in 2018. So that's how I got here, and I was completely oblivious to the war, even though I lived here, until right before the war started. I got the warnings in November. I happened upon War on the Rocks, Michael, Konrad, and started following Illia because you were all on Twitter. So I was observing this conversation as someone who had 70 people in 2 companies, that I had to say, when do I move my people out of Ukraine? Because I believed Michael. I saw the debates between Andriy and Michael on the Atlantic Council right before the war. When was the war going to start? Was it going to start? I listened to the podcast with Illia on Kyiv Independent, 9 February, where he was talking about whether Russia was really crazy enough to invade with such a small force. So I was just a consumer of all this till the war started, and then decided to come back and volunteer and set up a historical center, Borderlands Foundation, to help improve the conversation about what's happening between the different cultures I'm a part of. So that's how I came into this and organized this event.
Great, we'll return more to the Borderlands Foundation later, but Konrad, how did you first get into this crazy field of yours and become the specialist that you are? And I want to also talk about a little bit how different the media ecosystem, analytical community is in Poland versus some other Western countries, but what's your role in all this?
I think my story is, I'd like to think of it as being normal, really. Straight after university, which I studied Russian studies in the UK. Straight after that, I got a job at a British defense company where I worked as a military defense analyst covering Russia and Belarus. And as someone who lived his childhood literally next to a Soviet military base, I thought that was a natural path for me to follow, because I had an interest in Soviet and Russian military capabilities. So I spent at this company 7 years trying to understand how Russian military works. And then after a few years, I decided that it was time to step back from this role and establish a company which would essentially look at Russian and Belarusian operational capabilities, But essentially, at the very end of this road was the question: how and when does Russia go to war? And I think the first paper that I wrote as a independent defense analyst was "When Russia Goes to War," analysis for warning or something like that. So, given that the bulk of the company's activities was geared towards trying to predict where Russian next attack can potentially happen, I got very much involved into tracking Russian troop deployments near Ukraine, mostly from October 2021. And I was exchanging obviously views with Michael Kofman here. And from late November, early December, I was quite convinced that the buildup was very belligerent and that the Russian posture was changing from the defensive posture that was there since 2014 towards the one that had quite a lot of offensive potential. I tried not to answer the question whether the Russians were crazy enough to wage a war with limited force, with a peacetime posture. But nevertheless, I was concerned of mirror imaging, right? So I was afraid that how I would understand how Russia would go to war would actually impact my understanding of when it can actually happen. So we very much focused on the troop deployments and the changing of their offensive potential near the border with Ukraine. And at the end was I think the 21st of February or 22nd, where we actually issued a warning that the war would break out within 3 days. And then, unfortunately, we were right. But from analytical point of view, nevertheless, it's been incredible journey, because we finally saw how Russia goes to war and how it is conducting its military operations at the time where actually it is Moscow that decides the place and the time of the attack, and how it actually mobilizes or it doesn't, and how it conducts.
Yeah, and we'll touch more on that later. Mike, you of course also correctly predicted that Russia was actually going to invade and it wasn't just a bluff. What were some of the indications that really convinced you that that's what was in the offing? Because many people in Kyiv and also Washington and European capitals, of course, had really thought it was a bluff, had trouble accepting that the war was coming. But you also predicted that Russia would wage war in an entirely different way than it did. So if you could talk about what led you to these various conclusions, what you missed and what you got right.
Sure. Well, I think in the run-up to the war, the picture really began to form towards end of 2020, beginning of 2021. And the beginnings of it were a real change in Russian political rhetoric towards Ukraine. And the first set of deployments that started around February through April, this buildup. And it looked like a case of coercive diplomacy back then at that time. But it also looked very strange because, for one, Russia didn't have very visible demands with respect to Ukraine for a case of coercive diplomacy. In coercive diplomacy, people usually make strong demands or issue ultimatums. And afterwards, it was clear that something strange was happening, both on the military side and something different was happening on the political side. On the political side, well, I'm sure those people who read Vladimir Putin's long treatise and article, to me, it looked like he made a very compelling case that looked like it was the situation was on a trajectory to war. And for me, it began to look more a question of when rather than if. On the military side, there were strange things too. A few units didn't return from the deployment in the spring. They were left over there over the course of the summer under the pretext that they were going to participate in the Zapad strategic exercise. Then after that exercise, they also never left. They actually just hung around very far. These were units from Central Military District. It was very difficult to actually explain what they were doing there and what the Russian plan for them was. It began increasingly to look like they were lying about what the intentions were. Politically, there were more and more signs building up. There was that Kommersant article by Medvedev. There were other statements by Vladimir Putin. And so the entire picture began to emerge where both the military indicators and the political indicators started to align towards what increasingly looked like a worst case scenario. At least that was the way it appeared from my point of view. I think probably I was one of the folks earlier on who maybe saw this towards end of October or beginning of November. But if there were doubts, and there always were, because it felt like maybe Vladimir Putin had decided in principle, but not actually made a final decision. At the end of the day, we don't know. This is a bit of history that's yet to be written, right? Who knows how it really happened. But it began to look much clearer in December after Russia moved forward with these two draft treaties, which were effectively ultimatums that looked like a sort of rushed presentation of ultimatums. And when they were released publicly in December, it became clear that just from a base analytical standpoint, the Russian position was they were asking for something that they knew they couldn't get. There was no way the United States or Europeans or Ukrainians would agree to it. Second, they were asking it in a way specifically so as to ensure that they wouldn't get it. There's the mode by which they were conducting the diplomacy made it look very clearly that it was performative.
And according to a diplomat who's defected, apparently that came straight from the Kremlin rather than being developed in the foreign ministry.
Yeah, and the military buildup actually proceeded. And then, of course, you know, there's not just the fog of war, but there's the fog and the lateness of trying to assess what's happening with the military buildup. You're often getting an incomplete picture, or you're getting it kind of late. And so there were debates in local circles. What were we really seeing? How were the Russian military forces organized? Did they have all the key enablers? Were they going to show up late in the game? And I won't get into that nitty-gritty, but just to say, those were legitimate debates to have. But for people like me, it looked very clearly that we were on a path to winning. Konrad eventually, Konrad also joined me in that assessment. With regards to the operation itself, though, this is a very different question, and it's a very interesting one. So I think two areas where there was sort of, let's say, clear incongruence, or two things that I think and I won't speak for others, because there's a range of opinions in the community, right? Different analysts have different opinions, and there are always debates in the community. But two areas where we got things, I think, wrong, or at least incomplete for sure in terms of rightness. The first was the actual scope of the operation. I think there was an assumption that the Russian goals were maximalist, at least that was my position. There would be an attempt to conduct regime change, it would be an attempt to invade all of, if not most of, Ukraine, but then the scope of the operation would be a combined arms operation turned over to the general staff to run, right? And actually, it was a Russian attempt at regime change, believing that they could very easily overthrow the Ukrainian government and that they could actually somehow defeat Ukraine within 2 weeks. Okay, this was hard, to be honest, this was hard to predict because I would never imagine this to be true. As Konrad said, this sounds a little crazy. But it seemed very difficult to imagine that someone would actually build out an operation with those assumptions to invade what is, outside of Russia, the largest country in Europe, with one of the larger militaries, one of the larger populations, right? So the scope of the operation, I think, looked rather different than folks expected. But the other big part is, you know, they really did try to do it as a covert operation to Russia's own forces. That is, they didn't tell a lot of the troops about their final plans or destinations, so nothing was coordinated, nothing was sorted, from communications to logistics. They couldn't scale force employment, which is very difficult. And the entire affair was a shambles, and very quickly, Russian plans fell apart. Russian troops lost confidence or any trust they had in their officers. Morale, which was never good to begin with, plummeted, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that was very surprising about the Russian invasion is that many Russian forces seemed profoundly unprepared for it, you know, in the way you would prepare an actual military for a large-scale invasion. And this is not to put aside, you know, Ukrainian of resistance or the fight that the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian volunteers put up. It's just to say that on the Russian side, how different the initial days of the war were. And I'll make this final point. Still, that being put, I don't think the outcome was overdetermined, and I think it's remarkable how much hinged on those early days, the decisions that people took, the decisions that political leaders, military leaders, but also individuals took in those early days of the war.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you view the way, there's been a lot of reporting, especially lately, about how hard it was for the United States to convince many of its European partners and also its partners in Kyiv that that there was an invasion coming. Why was that so difficult to accept from Kyiv's perspective, or from some people?
Starting from 2020, we've been communicating this pretty much on a daily basis, that we realized that there was something coming up in general, but it was very difficult to estimate what exactly. because of course Russia was trying to manipulate through Minsk agreements, and there were all these diplomatic so-called tensions and so on. But we always understood that it is a strategic desire of Russia to destroy Ukraine. So on a very high level, strategic, there was no doubt about that. But then in April, when they started to collect troops, we didn't see them getting ready for actual invasion. So that was a troops collection. They placed the bases and so on. And that time we realized it was like to test the global response. So what would be the global response on that troop congregation? And we had to say that global response wasn't that prohibitive for the further actions. So it was they tried to calm down Putin, but not really to the point that he completely forgets about his further plans. For us, the huge bad news was the Nord Stream 2 approval in Washington. When we saw that in July, we said that was a massive negative kind of indicator, because obviously that showed that some people are ready to return to Russia as a sort of business as usual, at least in some scope. And then in October, when the congregation of the troops started to kind of assemble further, and there were first indications of the first statements from the administration about the invasions, we of course thought that they would still keep a pressure on the diplomatic front sort of through the Minsk as a kind of a plan A. Then it was clear that they are bringing troops to the point that something military is going to happen. About a year before that, we published a paper outlining how the invasion may look like from the south, from Kherson, from the Black Sea. Unfortunately, that's exactly how it happened. So it was clear that they would try to occupy Black Sea. It was clear that they would do something from the south, from Crimea. Then we realized that they would do on the something in the area of joint forces operation in Donbass. It was quite clear. And then of course the Belarus, the exercises in Belarus. At the same time, there were a whole number of the indicators that invasion is not going to be successful. So first of all, they had 150,000 troops, which was not enough to start the invasion on the 10 operational directions, starting from Zhytomyr, Kyiv, and then throughout the whole border to Mykolaiv and Odessa. So it's just, we considered that physically wasn't enough troops to do it. Also, the way they accumulated the troops with the convoys and with columns, not preparing the assault groups until the first day of the invasion, actually. The first assault group was done a night before the invasion. Assumed that, and of course we looked at that very attentively. So assumed that they were ready to move in like with a sort of transportation logistical mode rather than the assault mode, which was of course a massive mistake, and they did it, and that's how they lost a huge part of their forces. So basically, not having enough ready troops, not having enough quantity of the troops, and placing them on all areas around the border, kind of led us to the idea that from rational perspective, with that state of readiness, a rational commander would not start the operation of a full-scale operation. However, at that time we realized that there would be number of local ones, and of course Kyiv was a massive risk, about which we also published, but we were very skeptical that they would be successful there, which obviously that's as well how it happened. So yeah, there was a discontent between their state of readiness and their operational plans, and that's what made us, at least in our organization, was sort of wondering what exactly is in their mind.
Could you tell us what it was like, especially from your perspective, in those first early days of the invasion? What was it like being a journalist covering this conflict? What were the demands on your time? Where were you? Where were you going? What was just give us that perspective of the first days.
The first thing that got me on that period was the absolute lack of sleep. So we haven't had sleep in like 50, 60 hours, maybe 70 hours throughout the period, and maybe we could afford maybe 30 minutes of sleep because of because we were all just falling down of fatigueness. So yeah, I remember those moments because by the last days of the invasion, I finally settled down with the thought that this is going to happen. Even though I So a month before that, I denied the possibility of that because I never believed they're that stupid. So yeah, in the final days, in the final hours, I was already getting myself prepared for this. I took care of food. I took care of my loved ones. I made plans, what I do, what I want to do in this regard. So I made my choice that I'm staying in Kyiv and until the bitter end. But also I had to take care of my loved ones because I'm literally in the last night, in the night of the invasion, I made my mom leave Donbass. And she was on a train bound to Kyiv. So yeah, in the final hours come on, the sleepless nights of the invasion. So I was basically expecting the when, not if, because in the last days before the big invasion, we used to wake up to the sounds of nothing, of someone working in the backyard and thinking that today is not the day yet. So the final night, the final hours, and then we see Putin's face on our laptops delivering a speech about the special military operation. So what I did was I just got up and I started knocking on my roommate's door. Wake up, it's a war. And the guy was like, okay, I'm getting myself prepared for this. So this whole thing started, the Kyiv plunged into chaos. There was a gray, rainy day, with the sounds of jets, Russian jets and helicopters, because I live close to, Bucha, Irpin triangle. So this whole thing started, the war started. The city in chaos, panic. Many people were just not really realizing what's going on. So it was like something that we might imagine as we read books about the World War II, in the first days of World War II, maybe in Warsaw in 1939, something like that. So yeah, that was a bit of a shock. And what I was doing, I made the decision that I need to evacuate my mom to West Ukraine. And my flatmates decided to give me a car, and he was the driver. So he wanted to leave too, but I was absolutely sure that I need to get back here as soon as I can and do my thing, whether it's a journalistic thing or military thing. So I decided I'm not leaving, I'm staying here, and I will do what it takes. And that was a very hard decision because from our point of view right now, we understand that the Battle of Kyiv was successful, it was worth it. But at that point, I settled my mind at the understanding that I stay here as long as possible until the Russians come, and then we'll see what happens. So I think everybody was at the same level of thinking about this, is that is the final stand, and we do what we have to do at the moment. And I must say that in general, at many levels, and at personal level among ourselves, and at the level of government, political leadership in Ukraine, that was the best possible decision in that situation, to stay and fight and do our things about this. And this worked out for some reason.
Do you remember how many stories you filed in the first couple weeks after February 24th?
I think I had this basically the same pace of stories, which is like one story every several days. But what was great about the first days, what was surprising to me about the Kyiv Independent and about myself, is that basically we have the worst day too. And the whole team is like working like hell, because I never expected the whole team to be so, cohesive and so effective at that. And I think at the worst day 3, we already having a big story about analyzing what's happening with lots of maps, with lots of arrows going in and out, with lots of quotes from experts. So it's the very center of the inferno of the shock of the emotions. But Kyiv Independent is having stories like it's nothing. It's full-fledged, 100% effective stories that explain the whole thing, analyzing the whole thing, basically saying that the first push upon Kyiv by Russia has failed, and they started to bog down. They slow down in this regard. So yeah, that was very effective, and I'm really proud of my team, because I never expected to be psychologically and logistically and physically able to work during the full-fledged Russian invasion, which is not the very friendly work environment, I would say. But still, we were good about this.
Sam, could you tell us, you're American living in Kyiv, Ukrainian wife. Tell us, especially for those who are watching this who are not Ukrainian, What is it like living in the capital city in Kyiv during this time of war?
Well, what's interesting, just listening to Illia talk, was I was a Army veteran who thought I'd kind of parked that side of my life as in some dusty memory bank, and it all kind of kicked in as the lead up to the war started. And I was very worried. I didn't know the Ukrainian military. Watching the prognosis, I thought they were going to not last very long. And as a historian, my thoughts were, Grozny, and I need to get 70 team members to safety. And I remember when Ilya is telling that, sitting all the team members of my team down and looking them in the eye and say, you need to go west. 14 February, we're moving the company west. You need to get out. And the guys got mad at me. And they said, hey, I'm Ukrainian. Like, I'm not leaving. If the war starts, I'm not leaving. And the same thing, I was texting my wife's father right before the invasion, and we got her mother and her grandmother's out west. He said, don't worry about me. He said, I'm not going to leave the country. They knew martial law would mean they were locked in. I'm not going to leave the country. He said, if the war starts, I'm going to get the women out. I'm going to go back in and fight, and you take care of my daughter, right? And that was the text he sent to me. And at that point, I read Ilya's article, which he said right before the war, because I was following you, and I thought it was a bluff, because, well, no, I knew you thought it was a bluff for a while until the very end. And then he wrote an article that said, okay, well, guys, if this does happen, Ukrainian army is not screwed.
Yeah, it's not predestined, because many people imagine that, Ukraine will not fight back, nothing would happen from the point of view of international backlash. So it's not that simple for the Russians.
Yeah.
So I said that at every level, in every situation, there is something that we can do about this. Yeah. So from my point of view, I was saying that absolutely nothing is predestined until we just simply give up and do nothing about this. If we do something, we have a chance at every level. Be it the full-fledged response, military response, which is what happened, or guerrilla warfare about this. Prolonged guerrilla warfare, really brutal, very, very hard. So there's always something that we can do.
Yeah, I definitely didn't expect Ukraine to perform as well on the battlefield that it did. I expected a sort of long partisan warfare. It was very
this is something that I expected. I believed in my military. I knew that they will fight back. I knew that there will be an international response, which is basically what happened. What happened? But I expected a very long guerrilla warfare in which a large part of the population is involved, but the general military is at least partially debacled, so defeated.
Yeah. Sam, back to you, just fast forwarding to the present, what's it like living in Kyiv these days?
So I left right before the war started, and as soon as it started, I was...
No, let's just
talk
about the present.
So we decided to come back in July, because we missed it, and I put aside my business and said I'd like to volunteer. My wife and I want to raise our family here, and I said I didn't want to say when the war started we left, and we came back 3 years later. So we decided to come back, and Kyiv now it's come back to life until about a few weeks ago, and then the missile strikes hit very close to our apartment, about 600 meters away. We're at a park we always go walking in. My gym was also destroyed by a missile the same morning. But it doesn't scare you as much as some people react in different ways, but for me, yeah, you have to be scared for your safety, but also I realize why bombing didn't break the British during the Blitz, because you just get angry and you say, are they really gonna, it's not gonna break us. I feel part of Kyiv and Ukrainian community much more than America. So as an American, I feel more Ukrainian, especially since the war started. I aspire to be a great citizen of Ukraine and raise my family here. And I think a lot of people in the West are drawn to that, and they, a lot of them are moving here, doing humanitarian work. So for me, I feel much more alive and with purpose living here and trying to support the war effort in some small way than being back in the States where you feel helpless and you're watching it and you don't know what to do and how to support. So it's a lot better being here.
Konrad, what do you feel like some of the most important things that you've learned about the Russian military, which you've of course been studying for years, but after that first phase of the war, after Russia fell flat on its face, invaded in this very strange way, and Ukraine of course fought back ferociously. Since that phase of the war ended, what do you think are some of the important things that you've learned about the Russian military?
I remember Well, I mean, there are two very important concepts, I think, within the Russian military. The first one is the period of threat, and the second one is the initial period of war. And I think, within the period of threat, Russians were building up their forces, deploying them near the border, and so on and so forth. And then they created in their view, probably a fully capable force to conduct a regime change in Ukraine. So let's assume that, in their own minds, the armed forces were ready for the task. They chose the date and chose the time, and they chose the directions in which they will attack. And then the initial period of war started. And this is the time where I thought that, Russians have to achieve their strategic objective.
I'm sorry, I'm going to make you answer the actual question. Moving past that phase of the war.
No.
I'm going to start being very strict on this.
And then,
I've just been in Germany the last few days, so I'm going to be...
But I remember I wrote a tweet after 3 days saying that the Russian performance in this war is going to be much worse than in Georgia in 2008. Because in Georgia they only won because they had the mass. But the Russian performance within the very first few days was absolutely abysmal. And they got, apart from the south of Ukraine, they got stuck relatively quickly. They didn't conduct the combined arms operations. Air Force was not operating. The number of airstrikes and missile strikes that they conducted on Ukrainian targets across Ukraine was rather minimal. I personally expected Russians to conduct, at least a few days worth of campaign targeting Ukrainian key infrastructure bases. So I think, and one other thing that I expected them to do initially was to focus a lot on civilian strikes, on civilian targets, and it didn't happen. It didn't happen initially for the first few days, but after
weren't there tons of missile strikes that hit civilian targets in the first few days?
I don't think. I mean, I didn't see them happening. I didn't see them purposefully striking civilian targets. I think that they focused a lot on military items, but once they got stuck north of Kyiv, then they just went to the standard Russian way of war of attacking civilians.
I think they wanted to inherit everything intact because their assumptions were so fundamentally flawed that they'd be welcome.
They thought they could just walk in and take it.
Yeah. I'd like that. I know there's this video is going to come out several days after we've recorded it, but I know there's some journalism students here watching it live, and I'd like to draw attention to Konrad's answer for the journalism students, is he would do very well in Washington because he answered the question he wanted to be asked instead of the one that I asked. So Mike, can you answer the question that I asked?
All right, can you remind me what it was? We just got off. Sorry, we got off a very long train
What
ride
are the
this
most
morning.
important things that we've learned about the Russian military after that initial phase of the war?
Sure. So first, I think we learned that we grossly overestimated their level of training at the individual warfighter and unit. That's just the reality of it. And the reason for that is twofold. One, we only had small vignettes in terms of Russian force employment in prior wars to look at, meaning very small uses of force. And two, we had exercises, but exercises, the large ones they did were scripted military theater. And so it was very hard to tell whether they'd made really much progress to the 2000s, all right? The second part we learned about the Russian military is they still struggle a lot with integration of combined arms and air to ground. And going beyond the fact that nothing was properly sorted in advance of this invasion, right? After March 25th, they did try to reconstitute, right? Then they regressed to mean kind of the Russian way of war, which is a war by attrition, leveraging the Russian advantage in artillery and fires. And I just want to say that here's the way I look at it. The initial 5 days were definitely the most decisive period of this war. I think that's fair. But then after that, many folks kind of, I think, thought, okay, well, Ukraine is definitely winning this war now, but the truth is it actually got very difficult in May and June. That's where I think the United States and Western aid in terms of ammunition, artillery, and equipment also play an important part. Because one thing that I always harp on about wars come down, big conventional wars come down to attrition, replacement of manpower, material, ammunition, and the force that's better able to reconstitute over time, right, can then impose real dilemmas on their opponent. And that's what Ukraine was able to do over the course of 6 months as we got into August, right? I mean, I can make couple other points about what we learned regarding the Russian military in this war. I think fundamentally that's a military that really struggled at employing the force at scale. They hadn't attempted anything like this in many decades. This is another thing you can never tell easily about an adversary, right? You have to assume that they could do it, or you have to imagine that they could, because you can't just wave away the possibility. But trying to employ 150,000 troops or something like that along 3 fronts, they had an incredible amount of initial operational axis of advance that made no sense from a military strategy standpoint. No, just completely irrational force employment. By the way, I do think that this is something that Andriy and I both agreed on in the sense that we got this wrong. In the sense that we both got this wrong. We assumed irrational force employment, right? Andriy's assumption about Russian rational force employment led him to conclude that an invasion like that was unlikely, right? Whereas I had a different interpretation, but both had the same assumptions about rationality. And so one thing you learn is that military really struggles to scale. And by scaling, what I'm trying to say is, what you can do with a couple of battalions, communications, logistics, all the enabling components, right, command and control, you're going to struggle really hard to try to do that with 130 battalion tactical groups, plus thousands of Rosguardia who have no interoperability whatsoever, plus thousands of mobilized LDNR personnel, and who knows what they're using and how they're going to fight. And the Russian force was a sort of an incohesive mix. And the longer the war got on, meaning the longer it progressed, the less cohesive the Russian force was, because the more they took casualties, the less of the regular Russian military there was even in this war, right? The more it was mobilized fighters from LDNR, the more it was Wagner and Rosguardia and various volunteers.
Andriy, what are some of Ukraine's challenges? Obviously, setting aside the massive importance of continued Western military support and intelligence support, but what about the state of the Ukrainian force and personnel? What are some of Ukraine's challenges, especially if this war drags on potentially another year, maybe longer, in sustaining and keeping that force in the field?
Well, we have a number of obvious conclusions and facts. The fact that by January we had armed forces pretty much around 200,000, because we had 250,000 of the formal list, out of which 46 were civilians. So 206. Then we added 11 in January for the Territorial Defense Command. So but it was just January. So in fact, by the new year 2022, we had 200,000. Right now we have over 750 probably already, and this is not even the final numbers because we have a whole lot of volunteer groups and so on. So the actual number of uniformed services participating in the defenses is indeed close to 1 million. So having that massive rapid ramp up is of course is a challenge for any organization. So that's a challenge number one. The other one, of course, that we run out of weapons, we run out of ammunition. That became quite clear. It was clear always, but that transition to the NATO standards is difficult because we have tens, if not hundreds, of models of different types of equipment. And of course, that's what is called a zoo, which is like many different types of small quantities of different types, is a logistical nightmare. It's something which is extremely difficult to sustain. That gives us an opportunity to do lessons learned and to analyze how it works, and then pick up the most successful ones and use them in the future as the base models. But that's in the future. But right now we have that zoo, and right now, of course, that's an issue. Especially since we found out that the 155 caliber ammunition is not that interchangeable among the models. Which is traditionally NATO was projecting the idea that one of the goals of NATO is actually to be interchangeable.
Yeah,
don't tell Russia that.
The problem is
that's a
part two for the shot is the problem.
Public charges for the ammunition.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's those logistics. Of course, it's a massive challenge as a whole. And then we are talking about having a front line of well over 1,000 kilometers. Anyone running that operation is of course it's an enormous operational challenge. So I would pick up these three. What actually we're doing, and this is amazing, absolutely, is that we've been able to deny the access from the sea, which is obviously, even from rational perspective, Russians were supposed to be much more successful there. And the fact that we neutralize and we keep the fleet, Black Sea fleet, outside of the zone of the there was a strategy written in 2018 which was saying exactly that. But the fact that Ukraine executed that strategy, actually implemented that strategy, despite having very little of the fleet and the coastal missiles, is amazing. And also the fact that they couldn't reach the air superiority, which is probably the biggest unexpected by all community result. We knew that we have a strong air force. We knew that we had a strong air defense. But the fact that we could completely deny air superiority from Russia is, I think, that's an achievement which will be later analyzed by historians like Sam and others. It's something which we still don't yet fully appreciate, and especially like in a global community.
Well, and then Ukraine's ability to adapt has been very impressive in terms of piecing together this air defense, this disintegrated but integrated air defense system. And it was sort of on display. We were talking about this earlier, Sam, with these Iranian drones, is how quickly Ukraine seems to have adapted to defend the skies over Kyiv. Obviously, some missiles and drones have gotten through, but quite a lot. Most haven't.
And we are just in a very early stage of this denial, because we will have more capabilities, which basically would make us more successful in that in the near future, I believe.
The key problem behind the air defense grid is not mostly about the skill or the efficacy of single piece, but the lack of these pieces, in general at all levels. We need an integrated air defense system that is numerous. Let's call it that, more numerous than what we have. I think right now our air defense says it intercepts 87% of drones, and in general the efficacy of air defense against all targets in the air is 68, 63, 68, something like that.
Most air alerts never end up with a strike because of interception. But that's why the last few weeks was so interesting, because the Russians weren't able to hit Kyiv for several months. They went to a new swarm tactics with the drones and massive missile strikes, which Michael might deplete whatever they had left.
And that's with basically the same old S-300s and similar systems. If we could imagine that we have like twice the amount of those systems, that could be very good. RST is doing very great apparently. So it works. It actually works.
Oh yeah, it's already been working around Kyiv this last week.
And anyone can jump in on this one, but there's in the coming weeks there might be the arrival on the Russian side of many Iranian short-range missiles. What do you think? How well positioned is Ukraine to deal with that challenge?
I think this is basically something that we've been seeing for since day one. Big invasion by day one. As far as I understand, they are pretty similar to Iskanders. So we've seen quite a few Iskanders intercepted. So I guess that's basically the same thing. But to me, the big question is that they started employing this tactics that we did is basically DDoSing our defense systems with combination of missiles and drones, and so that something can go through. This is what we do, for instance, with HIMARS, as we send several Tochkas, and then HIMARS go through jammed defenses. My big question is how many do they have? Can they overload the defense grid here?
When we say swarm tactics, we should understand that this is not coordinated. So those drones and weapons, they're not coordinated between themselves. They don't have video channels. Obviously, for that distance, they cannot install video channels. So they send with each individual trajectory. The challenge is, of course, that they may overload our systems, but not in the way that the swarms do. So that's kind of easier than it might have been. And I don't believe that at the moment Iran, because Iran wasn't developing those drones for the type of the war which we have. Iran was developing drones in order to send it to Middle East, to Saudis and other countries, and against the non-moving targets. And essentially, they were just sending a bunch of drones, expecting that like 10% of them would reach the target, and that would be it. So, for that perspective, yes, that's a challenge. But let's not let's not give them too much credit for being that sort of high tech. It's not yet high tech weapon.
And now Iran's done the favor of showing its enemies in the region of showing what sort of air defense systems they need. So, Mike, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I just want a two-finger on it. I'd say that if they get these Iranian SRBMs, one of the challenges the Russian military has had, and I think this is another thing that we learned about them, is that while they have the capabilities, a lot of their concepts for employing them really aren't mature. They don't have the organizational processes and adaptations. And this is something, at least I've observed in countries that acquire the technology and someone try to imitate Western militaries. They don't actually have good experience using these kind of capabilities. So the process of putting together the strike mission, figuring out targets, then doing battle damage assessment, and going through the cycle is something that Russian military looks profoundly inexperienced in doing. They have the capabilities, but they can't quite put it together. I think that's quite fortunate. And they've still, from what I've seen throughout this war, struggled to figure out how to effectively employ long-range precision-guided weapons. Some folks really hone in on the weapons themselves, right? But I think actually the story that there's a problem with Russian weapons is somewhat a misnomer. I think the issue you see very clearly is that they struggle at targeting. They're not very good at it all. They have either very poor maps or very good targeting data. They consistently miss things that it's clear that they're trying to aim for. And they don't have very good processes for employing these weapons, right? And so to some extent, yes, it'll be a big problem because I think they will be able to replenish some of their lost arsenal of SRBM, short-range ballistic missiles. But on the other hand, I'm not so sure that any of the organizational processes will have improved for how they actually use them, right? They seem woefully behind. And that was difficult to tell from prior cases when they first started using in Syria as a sort of almost very minor boutique use of precision-guided weapons in a very kind of controlled environment, right, when it was fairly easy for them. But then again, when they tried to scale it in the war in Ukraine, it revealed that they actually were very immature and had not developed a lot of processes and organizational structures to employ these kind of weapons at scale.
Konrad, do you want to add anything to that? No? Well, but I do have a question for you. Could you talk to us more about the politics from Warsaw's perspective on this? Obviously, Poland's been critical in terms of accepting Ukrainian refugees and also helping coordinate supply routes, many of which go through Poland, of course. Could you talk about how Poland's view of the conflict has maybe evolved over time, or what are some of the more pressing aspects of it from Poland's perspective?
I think the Warsaw's response has been quite direct, and Warsaw made it clear from the day one that Russia is a threat that needs to be dealt with in a kinetic way, that no negotiations, no peace treaties are going to solve the problem of Russia. And therefore they decided to essentially send as much equipment as they possibly can without significantly degrading operational capabilities of the Polish armed forces. And I stress significantly because they have been degraded in some way. Therefore, I think every single Soviet piece of equipment that was still on the tracks and not in a big state of decay was essentially sent to Ukraine. And we are talking about the BMP-1s, we are talking about T-72s, we are talking about PT-91s, which are the latest Polish development of the T-72s. We are talking about self-propelled howitzers. We are talking about the most modern Krab self-propelled howitzers as well, of which Poland sent 56, I believe, which is, I think, everything that Poland had, or close to everything that Poland had at the time. And all the equipment that Warsaw could possibly give, the Ukrainians received, and I'm actually quite certain that a lot of stuff is actually given to Ukrainians without actually making a big fuss of it. Obviously, there are shoulder-launched air defense systems as well, which have been really potent against Russian aircraft and helicopters. And I really do not believe that the Polish support for Ukraine will cease in the long term. So that's the military side, and obviously there's the humanitarian side, where so many refugees were actually accepted into Polish homes. It was totally bottom-up approach. The government had actually relatively small impact on how this was done initially. So it was an amazing thing to see.
Could you talk about, on our journey on the way into the country, you were talking about how Poland is sort of repositioning its force posture within the country in terms of where its forces are arrayed. Many of its older bases, of course, were looking towards East Germany, what was then East Germany, but bases are sort of being moved to focus on the other frontier, to be focused on Belarus. Could you talk a bit about that?
Right, so just after 2014, that was actually a year later, in 2015, I think the government made a decision to pre-position some of the Leopards tanks closer to the border with Belarus and Ukraine. They essentially sent them to Warsaw, which was a big shift because the bulk of the Polish armored capabilities are still based in the western part of the country, getting ready to attack NATO. So that's obviously the Soviet legacy. But the truth is that the Polish military capabilities were absolutely unfit to deal with Russia at any level, essentially. And the number of divisions were insufficient. So the current government decided to create a new division, which is now being stood up in eastern parts of the country, and now the second division is being planned. It's obviously debatable to what extent the MOD will be able to recruit enough personnel to actually man these divisions, because in general the Polish armed forces are undermanned, without getting into specifics. So that's something which is a bit concerning, but on the other hand, the Polish government has gone on a massive buying spree, getting as much equipment as possible based on the lessons learned from Ukraine. So we are getting equipment from the United States and South Korea in really massive numbers. Really massive numbers.
Sam, I want to give you an opportunity to talk a bit more about your foundation and what you hope to accomplish with it.
Well, one of the things that, as a historian who's lived through a war in Iraq and studied it my whole life, day 3 of the war, or actually the first day the war started, I couldn't focus on my tech company. So I realized that I needed to go into being a historian full time, and I want to document this war with the skills I've developed my whole life, studying and teaching history. And I believe that this is a once in 100-year event in terms of importance. Europe every 100 years seems to have really important events, and this is the beginning, I think, of that period where the next 100 years will be decided now. And the next peace that is formed, that's durable in Europe, will come whenever this is over. So I think history also is created by the victors. The old saying, everyone says it's written by the history, or history's written by the victors, but I believe that history is written by the victors before it happens. And the thing that I saw on day 2 of the war was President Zelensky, who I think Michael said something very interesting before the war. He said, who knows what President Zelensky's doing? He was not impressed. I think a lot of people in Ukraine weren't impressed with President Zelensky. His approval rating was 35%. But he's risen to the occasion, and he's telling a story, I think, that's effective of what can and should be the future of Ukraine. And it's really up to us to start telling the story that's happened so far, using those lessons to keep creating that better outcome that Ukraine and I think the rest of the West wants, well, most of the rest of the West. And so I think history is instrumental to creating the future you want. And the earlier you get started and you interview the people that have been involved in it, that actually have seen the fighting, you capture those lessons. It's not just some dusty academic topic. It creates narratives that can be self-fulfilling. And I think President Zelensky did that and started that.
Did we figure out a mechanism for them to ask questions, or did we not? No. That's
Well,
fine
I
if
think
we
we can
didn't. I
just
was
invite
asking.
people if they
No,
want to
no,
come
no,
ask.
it's fine. I'm moderating.
That's right. That's why I put you in charge.
Yeah. Last, I'd like to ask you two. Obviously, this conflict is covered extensively in the West and the rest of the world. But what are some things that you think are still not getting through enough to outside audiences that you wish were better understood by these outside audiences about the conflict?
I don't know, maybe the moral aspect. This is what I've been thinking about for quite a long time, and it consumes me really. And I've been thinking, what's the central conclusion out of this war? Obviously, we have lots of conclusions militarily, politically, but what's the most centric answer to the question what has happened? I mean, to me, I think this war was an illustration and is an illustration of the very simple moral principle of not going the easiest way possible in this regard. So always going the hardest way, because easy way to go is always like a deal with the devil that never ends well, and it goes for ordinary people, but also politicians and decision makers in this regard. So ordinary people decided to do something about this war and not to simply give up and offer Russians a fight, and it worked out. Politicians in this country did so as well. They just decided not to leave Kyiv, for instance, and to do something about it, and it worked out. And same goes to European, Western decision makers and leaders. Hopefully, they have surrendered with their attempts to find the easy solution to this. Just give in to Putin, give Putin what he wants, and get some sort of illusion of peace in this regard. But actually, it's just getting a deal with the devil. So they decided to go the hard way, provide Ukraine with weapons and go the full way to real victory of real solution to this massive issue, rather than trying to cover it up. So they made historical decisions and made decision as historian, as politics in the historical times, rather than mediocre managers. So maybe this is what we should be talking more loudly about. The moral lesson of the story is do as your consciousness says, rather than trying to walk out of the problem. So it works for all levels.
Of course, we are interested in the global community to support us further. That's obvious, because and it's not just because of the weapons. It's just general support, and it's critical for our survival. And partly that's why we're here, and partly that all those advocacy efforts which we do, and so on. But the world, I think, that not entirely understands the global and strategic, historical implications of this war yet. For example, I mean, the reason the world actually exists as it is, especially Western countries, is because they have a set of laws which keep them together, and that's basically what makes the Western countries successful, and so on. So and all the laws are as good as the extent to which they can be enforced. So if you cannot enforce the law, you get into chaos. So imagine the criminal system, for example, which you cannot enforce. That's it. That's chaotic. So now I'm going to tell you one type of a law which is not enforced, and that's why it's chaotic. It's international public law. You cannot enforce the international law. And there is no global courts and a global police which can deal with the aggressor. So that's why we have those issues, is because the global system cannot guarantee other countries' safety unless they're part of NATO. NATO is actually the most successful answer to this problem so far. But for all countries which are partners of NATO but not yet members of NATO, there is no answer. And as we can see right now, no Western country can feel safe if it's in a doorstep. In the 21st century, we have a war like ours, which is the biggest one since World War II, with the enormous amount of atrocities, casualties, and unimaginable losses, and so on. So the world needs to find a solution how to make the wars like that impossible in the future. Not, of course, it's naive to say that we will have an answer for the whole world, but at least to some extent, when there is a global coalition of support, that global coalition needs to end up with a success, and it's critical that what we do right now ends up with absolute ultimate success. Because if there is no success, if there is some sort of a gray area or some kind of a not clear success or something, that reinforces the other aggressors to start, or even Putin to continue if he's still alive by the end of the war, which I'm not sure. But nevertheless, so we need to show to the world that the cases like that end up with the coalition success and the aggressors' absolute clear failure. Putin needs to fail without any compromises. Only in this case we can say that it was worth it, for the world to support us. And obviously, the other example is that by the end of this war, we will know the future of the nuclear weapons, whether they still make sense or they're kind of a useless piece of metal which nobody should spend money. Because if Putin is hypothetically successful with deterring the West using these threats of nuclear weapon, if, for example, there are any compromises under the threat of the nuclear weapon, everybody will want nuclear weapon. The whole world will start to buy nuclear weapons, especially tactical ones. It's not that expensive, because that would be the only way for the country to guarantee the sovereignty. And that's it. And we end up with the end of the world as we know it. And that's a very, very horrible future for us, which we need to prevent. At the same time, as Putin fails the war and he loses, and we win, and he still cannot use the nuclear weapon to his advantage, now everybody will understand that nuclear weapon doesn't make sense to invest in because they don't bring you any success. So we will see a massive proliferation, and essentially we will getting into completely safe space. Well, more safe than it is right now. So that's important to understand.
Well, yeah, if we could extend the conversation into nuclear issues and deterrence, but that would probably make it last another hour. I think that's a great place to end it, but it's been an honor to be here, and thank you all for joining us on our trip to Ukraine and Kyiv.
Thank you.
Thank you.